Thrown out at 17, she built a cabin inside a hollow sequoia. Silas Lovelace, who had ranched the Kauai foothills for 23 years, told her, "You'll freeze inside that rotted-out tree. They'll find your bones picked clean by bears." She had $4, no family, and needed shelter she could not build. On February 11th, 1890, 9 feet of snow fell in 48 hours. But 5 months earlier, Clara Briggs had never held an axe, never started a fire without matches, never spent a single night alone outdoors. The teamster found Clara scrubbing pots in the back room of the boarding house on Mill Street. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, and told her what her uncle had said. "Old enough to manage." Those were Josiah's words. He had taken up with a widow in Three Rivers and would not be sending wages anymore, would not be coming back, would not be providing for his dead sister's daughter, as he had promised when Clara was 15 and had no one else. Clara set down the pot. Her hands were wet. She wiped them on her apron and did not speak. The teamster shifted his weight. "I'm sorry, miss. I wouldn't have wanted to be the one to tell you, but he said, I heard what he said." The landlord gave her 1 week. She had $4.30 after paying the room. $4 to survive a California winter. $4 to build a life from nothing. She counted the coins 3 times as if counting might multiply them, and then she put them in the pocket of her dress and walked out of Visalia heading east toward the mountains where her uncle had gone. She did not know what she would find. She only knew that Visalia held nothing for her now. The foothills rose brown and dry in the July heat. 2 years of drought had cracked the earth and withered the grass. Clara walked 18 miles in 2 days, sleeping beside the road with her coat for a pillow and her hunger for company. The town she passed through, Lemon Cove, Wood Lake, had no work for a 17-year-old girl with no family and no references. The men looked at her too long. The women looked away. She reached Three Rivers on the 3rd day. The settlement was barely a town, a scattering of wooden buildings along the Kauai River, a general store, a blacksmith, a few dozen families scratching out lives in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada. Clara asked at the store if anyone knew Josiah Briggs. They knew him. Everyone knew the new man living with the widow Harmon up the North Fork. Clara did not go looking for him. She did not want to see his face. She did not want to hear whatever excuse he would offer. Instead, she asked if anyone needed help. Cooking, cleaning, anything. The storekeeper shook his head. The blacksmith's wife said she managed fine alone. A woman with 3 children looked at Clara's soft hands and thin dress and said nothing at all. That was when Clara met Silas Lovelace. He was leaning against the porch rail of the general store, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble the mountains could produce. His family had ranched the Kauai foothills since the 1860s. He had survived the floods of '62, when the rivers rose 30 feet and drowned cattle by the hundreds. He had survived the drought of '77, when the grass turned to dust and the wells went dry. He had buried 3 neighbors who thought they could winter alone in the high country. Lovelace studied Clara the way a man studies a horse he does not intend to buy. "You're the Briggs girl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." "Josiah's niece." "Yes, sir." Lovelace pushed himself off the rail. "Your uncle owes money all over this county. He's not a man people trust, and that trust doesn't extend to his relations. You won't find work here." Clara felt the $4 in her pocket. $4. She could survive perhaps a week on that if she ate almost nothing. And then what? "I'll work for food," she said. "I don't need wages, just food and a place to sleep." Lovelace shook his head slowly, as if he were explaining something to a child who would not understand. A girl alone can't survive a foothill winter, he said. The colony people up at Advance take in strays sometimes, but they're full up with their own troubles. You'll freeze inside whatever shack you find, and when spring comes, they'll find your bones picked clean by bears. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a biscuit wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Clara. Eat that. Walk back to Visalia. Find the county poor farm. It's not a pleasant place, but you'll live through the winter. He did not offer work. He did not offer shelter. He gave her a biscuit and a prediction of death, and then walked away to see to his own business. Clara ate the biscuit standing on the porch of the general store, watching the sun drop behind the western hills. She thought about the poor farm in Visalia, the overcrowded rooms, the gray-faced widows, the smell of despair. She thought about the men in the lumber camps, dozens of them to every woman, rough and lonely, and looking at her the way the men on the road had looked at her. She thought about her uncle's words, old enough to manage. Manage what? With what? The math was simple and brutal. A room in Visalia cost $8 a month. She had 4. A cord of cut firewood cost $3. She could afford 1 cord and would have nothing left for food, no shelter to burn it in, no way to survive what was coming. Winter arrived in the Sierra foothills by late November. That gave her 4 months to find shelter, gather 6 cords of firewood, and store enough food to last until spring. 4 months, $4. No skills, no tools, no land. She finished the biscuit and walked east toward the mountains. Clara had never seen a giant sequoia. Nothing in Missouri, nothing in the mining camps and lumber towns where she had drifted with her uncle had prepared her for the trees she found 2 days later in the mountains east of Hammond. They were impossible. Trunks 30 feet across, rising straight as church steeples into a canopy, so high she had to crane her neck until it ached just to glimpse the branches. The bark was the color of cinnamon, rough and fibrous, furrowed like the skin of ancient giants. She put her hand against one trunk and could not feel the curve. The tree was so large it seemed flat, like a wall that went on forever. She walked among them for an hour, tilting her head back, trying to comprehend the scale. These trees had been growing when Christ walked the earth. They had stood here for 2,000 years, watching the mountains rise and the rivers carve their canyons. They would stand here long after Clara Briggs was dust. That was when she found the dead one. It stood apart from the others, killed by fire perhaps decades earlier. The top had broken off somewhere above 100 feet, leaving a jagged spire against the sky. The interior was blackened, hollowed by flames that had consumed the heartwood but left the outer shell intact. Clara walked around it slowly. The cavity where the fire had burned was enormous, wide enough for a room, deep enough for a cabin. The opening faced east, away from the prevailing winds. The bark was still attached, still thick, still protecting whatever remained inside. She stepped into the hollow. The charred wood was dry beneath her feet. The smell of old smoke lingered, faint but present. The walls curved around her like the inside of a cathedral, blackened and scarred, but solid. Light filtered through gaps in the wood overhead, casting pale stripes across the floor. Clara pressed her hand against the bark from inside. 2 feet thick, maybe more at the base. She pushed, testing its strength. The bark was soft, almost spongy, layers of fiber with air trapped between them. She thought of the quilts her mother had made back in Missouri. Layers of fabric with batting between, holding warmth against the body. Her mother had explained it once. The air pockets trapped heat, kept it from escaping. A thin blanket couldn't warm you, but a thick quilt could, because the layers of trapped air held your own warmth close. The bark was like that. 2 feet of trapped air held in fibrous layers wrapped around a hollow core. Clara stood in the dead sequoia for a long time, thinking, if bark holds warmth like a quilt, and this tree is hollow like a room, then the tree already was shelter. She would not need to build anything. She would need only to move inside what fire had already made. She spent 3 days studying the sequoia before she made her decision. She walked around it 100 times, looking for cracks, for rot, for any sign that the structure was failing. The base was solid, the roots still anchored in the earth, spreading out in every direction for 100 feet or more. The trunk was sound above the fire scar, the living wood that had once circled the core, now exposed and dried but still intact. She looked at other sequoias, living ones, to understand how they survived. The bark on the living trees was even thicker, 3 feet in places, and showed the black scars of countless fires. The trees burned but did not die. The bark protected them. She asked herself the question that would determine whether she lived or died. Why did the bark protect the trees from fire? The answer came slowly, in pieces. Fire was hot, hundreds of degrees, maybe thousands. The bark was thick, full of air pockets that did not conduct heat. By the time the heat worked through 2 feet of fibrous bark, the fire had moved on. The living wood inside never reached the temperature that would kill it. If bark could keep fire heat out, could it keep body heat in? The physics seemed the same. Heat moved from hot to cold, but it moved slowly through materials that did not conduct well. 2 feet of bark filled with air pockets would slow the movement of heat in either direction, keeping fire out or keeping warmth inside. Clara did not have the words for thermal conductivity or insulation. She had a mother's quilts and the logic of a desperate mind, but the reasoning was sound. The tree could keep her alive. She was almost certain. Almost. Martin Cawley found her dragging planks across a clearing near the abandoned logging camp. Cawley was a Kauai colonist, one of the utopians who had built a settlement called Advance, 3 miles up the mountain. The colony was a strange experiment in cooperative living, 300 people who shared everything and owned nothing individually. They had been building a road to the giant forest for 3 years, trying to reach the big trees so they could log them and fund their commune. Cawley was in his 40s, a carpenter by trade, with calloused hands and a skeptic's squint. He watched Clara wrestle the planks through the underbrush and finally called out, "Those are mill property, girl." Clara stopped. The plank she was dragging was 6 inches wide and nearly 5 feet long, perfect for a door. She had found a pile of them abandoned near a burned-out saw site. "The mill's been closed 2 years," she said. "Nobody's coming back for them." Cawley walked closer, examining the planks. "What do you need them for?" Clara hesitated. Then she told him. She explained the dead sequoia, the hollow interior, the bark that was 2 feet thick. She explained her plan to clean out the charred wood, build a door to seal the opening, install a small stove vented through a hole in the bark. She explained that she had $4 and no one to help her and 4 months until winter. Cawley listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "A standing dead sequoia," he said. "You want to live inside a standing dead sequoia?" "Yes." "Child, those trees fall without warning. One good windstorm and it'll come down on you like the wrath of God. I've seen them go. No sound, no warning, just 2,000 tons of wood hitting the ground hard enough to shake the mountain. You'll be inside when it happens, and they'll dig what's left of you out of the splinters." Clara had considered this. "The living trees don't fall. I've seen blown down ones, but they rotted at the base first. This one hasn't rotted. The wood is solid." Cawley shook his head. "Even if it stands, you can't heat a space that size with a $2 stove. You'd need a firebox twice as big. And you'd burn through a cord of wood a month just trying to stay alive. You've got no money, no help, and no experience. You're building your own coffin. He said the words without cruelty. He said them the way you would tell someone not to step off a cliff, a simple statement of fact. Clara picked up the plank and resumed dragging it toward the Sequoia. Collie watched her go. He did not try to stop her. He did not offer help. But he did not take the planks back either. The stove cost $2.50. Clara found it in the back room of the Hammond General Store, a tiny sheet iron box, 18 inches square, with a 4-inch flue pipe and a door that did not quite close properly. It had been used in a mining camp somewhere, then abandoned when the camp played out. The storekeeper wanted $3. Clara offered $2. They settled on $2.50. Clara handed over more than half of everything she had and carried the stove out of the store in pieces. It weighed perhaps 30 pounds assembled. She could not carry it 6 miles to the Sequoia in one trip. Her arms gave out after half a mile. She cached the pieces in a hollow log, returned for more, cached again. It took her 3 days to move the stove from Hammond to the tree. She had $1.70 left. $1.70 and a stove and a pile of salvaged planks and a hollow tree that might save her life or might crush her in her sleep. Late August, 3 months until winter, she began to work. The door came first. Clara had never built anything more complicated than a biscuit. She had no hammer, no nails, no saw. She had 8 planks roughly 6 inches wide, a knife her uncle had left behind, and strips of bark she peeled from fallen branches. She lashed the planks together with the bark strips, weaving them through holes she carved with the knife. The work took 4 days. When she was finished, the door was roughly 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, not large enough to fill the opening, but large enough to cover most of it. She wedged the door into the hollow, then packed the gaps with mud and pine pitch. The mixture stank of turpentine and took days to dry. She applied it in layers, the way she had seen frontier builders chink their cabins, mud first, then pitch on top to seal it, then more mud to cover the pitch. It was not a good door. Gaps remained along the edges where the curved opening of the tree refused to meet the flat surface of the planks. Cold air would seep through those gaps, but it was a door. It was more than she had expected to build. The interior came next. 3 weeks of scraping charred wood from the walls. She worked with a flat stone, chipping away the carbonized layers until she reached pale, dry heartwood beneath. The work bloodied her hands. Black carbon dust coated her skin, her hair, her lungs. She coughed black for a week straight, bent over at the edge of the hollow, spitting dark gobs onto the ground. The space that emerged was roughly 8 feet wide at the floor, narrowing to perhaps 6 feet at head height. The ceiling, the underside of the surviving trunk, rose 12 feet above, blackened but solid. The floor was uneven, humped with the roots that anchored the tree, but dry, perfectly dry, even after 2 years of drought. Clara lined the floor with pine boughs gathered from fallen branches, layered 2 feet thick. On top she placed every scrap of cloth she could find, burlap sacks from the abandoned mill, a worn blanket traded for a day's kitchen work in Hammond, scraps of canvas too damaged to sell. The stove was the hardest part. She had to cut a hole for the flue pipe, a hole through 18 inches of bark. She borrowed a hand drill from the Hammond blacksmith, offering to clean his shop in exchange for a week's use. The drill bit was meant for wood, not bark. The fibrous layers clogged the bit every few rotations. She cleared it, drilled again, cleared again. 2 days to bore a hole 4 inches across. Her shoulders screamed, her wrists swelled. The hole emerged at last, ragged and imperfect, angled slightly upward to prevent rain from pooling. She fitted the stovepipe through the hole and sealed around it with the same mud and pitch mixture she had used on the door. She positioned the stove itself near the center of the hollow, where the floor was most level, and ran the pipe up and out through the bark. When she lit the first fire, she stood outside the tree for an hour, watching for flames. The bark did not catch. The mud held. Smoke rose from the pipe and dissipated into the evening air. The Sequoia was a cabin now, a crude one, an unlikely one, but a cabin. End of September, 8 weeks until winter. Emmett Grady found her in early October. Grady was the foreman at the Smith Comstock mill operation, or what was left of it. The mill had closed 2 years earlier when the company realized that giant sequoia wood shattered when felled, producing fence posts and shingles instead of lumber. But Grady still walked the company's claims as if he owned them, and he still considered himself a man of authority. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a face that had been hit too many times and a voice that expected obedience. He had known Clara's uncle as a mediocre worker and a man who owed gambling debts. Clara was gathering firewood when Grady appeared. She had built a stack near the Sequoia, half a cord so far, split from deadfall and piled against the bark. She was adding to it when she heard boots behind her. "Briggs girl," Grady said. Clara straightened. She held a length of branch in her hands like a club, though she did not raise it. "Mr. Grady, you're on mill company land. The mill's closed. The claim's not." Grady walked closer, looking at the Sequoia, at the door wedged into the opening, at the thin stream of smoke rising from the pipe. "You built that?" "Yes." "Inside the tree?" "Yes." Grady laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Girl, you're either crazy or stupid, probably both." He stopped laughing. His face hardened. "This land is claimed under the Timber and Stone Act. Squatters have no rights. You understand?" Clara said nothing. "I could have Sheriff Parker out here in 2 days," Grady continued. "He'd drag you out of that tree and haul you back to Visalia where you belong. The poor farm would take you, or the county jail if you gave them trouble." Clara still said nothing. Her knuckles were white on the branch. Grady stepped closer. "Your uncle owes me $14, gambling debts. He ran off before he paid. I'm going to collect it one way or another, girl." He looked at Clara the way the men on the road had looked at her, the way men looked at things they intended to take. "You can work it off at the camp," he said. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever else needs doing, or I can take it out of whatever you think you're building here." Clara held his gaze. "My uncle's debts aren't mine." "They are now." "No." Clara's voice was steady, though her hands shook. "They're not. I didn't borrow from you. I didn't gamble. I don't owe you anything, and if you try to collect from me, I'll tell Sheriff Parker exactly what kind of work you're offering a 17-year-old girl." Grady's face darkened. For a moment, Clara thought he would hit her, or worse. The clearing was empty. The nearest settlement was 6 miles away. No one would hear her scream. Then Grady stepped back. "You'll change your mind when the cold comes. When you're starving and freezing and begging for help, you'll remember what I offered." He turned and walked away through the trees. Clara watched him go, still gripping the branch, still shaking. She did not sleep that night. Every sound in the forest became footsteps. Every creak of the tree became someone forcing the door. Grady did not return, but his threat hung in the air like smoke, always present, impossible to ignore. The firewood was never enough. By the end of October, Clara had 3 cords stacked against the Sequoia. She rose before dawn and worked until dark, dragging deadfall from the forest floor, splitting it with a wedge and a rock, stacking it in crisscrossed rows to season in whatever sun reached the clearing. 3 cords. She needed 6 at minimum. Collie had set a cord per month. and winter would last at least 6 months. But she was burning a quarter cord just to stay warm through the October nights, and her rate of gathering had slowed as the easy deadfall near the tree ran out. Her hands were cracked and bleeding, her shoulders ached constantly. She had lost weight, 10 pounds, maybe more, from the labor and the meager diet of acorns and wild onions and the occasional rabbit caught in a snare. She was hungry all the time. The first frost came October 15th. Clara woke to ice on the pine boughs outside the tree, to a crust of white on the woodpile, to air cold enough to see her breath. She checked the temperature inside the sequoia. Not warm, but warmer than outside. The bark was doing something. By late October, the aspens had dropped their leaves and the sky had turned the color of iron. Old-timers in Hammond said the drought was breaking. They could smell snow coming. Clara had heard what drought years meant in the Sierra Nevada. 2 or 3 dry winters, then the pattern broke violently. The snowpack that should have accumulated over years fell all at once. Rivers flooded, roofs collapsed, people died. She worked harder, 4 cords by the end of October. The math still did not work. Then the November windstorm hit. Clara heard it coming, a roar in the distance growing closer, like a train barreling through the forest. She ran for the sequoia and wedged the door shut behind her just as the wind reached the clearing. The noise was incredible. Branches cracked and fell. Whole trees snapped somewhere nearby, the deep booming crash of timber going down. The sequoia swayed. Clara felt the movement in her bones. The floor tilted, just slightly, then tilted back. The walls groaned. The entire tree was moving, bending in the wind like a reed. For 3 hours she crouched in the hollow, certain that each gust would be the last, that the tree would finally let go of the earth and come crashing down with her inside. She thought of Cawley's words. 2,000 tons of wood hitting the ground hard enough to shake the mountain. The tree did not fall. When the wind finally died, Clara pushed open the door and surveyed the damage. Her firewood pile was destroyed. The carefully stacked cords had been scattered by the wind, buried under fallen branches, crushed beneath a pine that had toppled across the clearing. She spent 4 days recovering what she could, a quarter cord, maybe less. The rest was lost. 2 3/4 cords remaining, 3 weeks until hard winter. She sat beside the ruined woodpile as the sun went down and allowed herself for the first time to consider the possibility that Lovelace had been right. Martin Cawley appeared 3 days later with a mule loaded with firewood. Clara was scraping bark from a fallen branch when she heard the animal approaching. She stood, knife in hand, expecting Grady or one of his men. Instead, she saw the colonist carpenter leading a mule piled high with split wood, a full cord bundled and ready to stack. "What is this?" Clara asked. Cawley tied the mule to a branch and began unloading. "The colony has surplus. We cut more than we needed for the common kitchen." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." Cawley set down an armload of wood. "We're socialists. We believe in helping those in need." Clara did not know what socialists were. She did not care. "Why?" Cawley paused, considering the question. "I told my wife about you. The girl building a coffin in a dead tree. She said if I didn't bring you something, she'd come up here herself and drag you back to Advance." "I won't go to the colony." "Didn't ask you to do that either." Cawley resumed unloading. "My wife just wants to know you're not dying alone up here. She's got opinions about how people should treat each other." They worked together in silence, stacking the firewood against the sequoia. When they were finished, Clara had 3 3/4 cords, still short, but closer. Cawley studied the door, the smoke rising from the flue pipe, the pine bough bed visible through the gaps in the planks. "You've done good work," he said. "Better than I expected." It might not be enough. No, it might not. Collie untied his mule. You can pay me back in spring if you make it that far. He did not sound confident that she would, but he had come anyway. He had helped anyway. Clara watched him lead the mule back down the mountain and did not know what to say. So she said nothing and went back to gathering wood and tried not to think about the math that still did not work. By late November, the Sequoia was ready. Clara had been living inside the tree for 4 months. The shelter worked, better than she had hoped, better than anyone had predicted. On a test night with the temperature at 32 degrees outside, the interior held at 44. The bark was insulating. The stove was sufficient. The small space heated quickly and held that heat through the night. 3 3/4 cords of firewood, 10 days' worth of food, acorns, and dried rabbit, and a small sack of flour she had traded work for in Hammond. Physical condition, exhausted, underweight, but alive. The first significant snow fell on December 23rd, 2 feet overnight. Clara woke to silence, the world muffled and white, every sound absorbed by the blanket of snow that surrounded the Sequoia. She pushed open the door and saw the tree rising from the drifts like a pillar, its cinnamon bark dusted with white. Inside, the temperature held at 38 degrees. December passed. January brought colder temperatures, 4 degrees below zero on the coldest night, but the bark held. The interior dropped to 36 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, but warm enough to survive with the stove burning and the quilted bed piled high. She was using less wood than Collie had predicted, a 1/4 cord per week, not a cord per month. The small space, the insulating bark, the banked coals that held heat through the night, it all added up to survival math that might actually work. By early February, Clara had burned through 1.5 cords. She had 2 1/4 remaining. If the weather held normal, she would make it to spring with wood to spare. But the old-timers in Hammond were watching the western sky. Something is coming, they said. From Alaska. Something worse than anything in memory. Clara heard the rumors when she walked to Hammond for supplies. A cyclone stalling over the Sierra, 20 feet of snow at Donner Pass. Trains stranded, people dying, the railroad blocked for weeks. She added extra wood to the pile inside the Sequoia. She melted snow and stored the water in clay pots near the stove. She ate less, rationing what remained of her food. The first 10 days of February brought clear skies and bitter cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero. Clara burned more wood than usual, nearly half a cord in those 10 days alone. Remaining firewood, 1 3/4 cords. Remaining winter, approximately 2 months. The Sequoia had been tested and had passed every test, but the real test, the one everyone had warned her about, had not yet arrived. On February 10th, Clara woke with a fever. The cough that had plagued her since January had worsened overnight into something deeper, something that rattled in her chest and left her dizzy when she stood. She could barely keep the fire fed. She could barely lift herself from the pine bough bed. Outside, the sky was clear and cold. Inside, Clara shivered beneath every blanket she owned and tried to sleep. She did not know that 200 miles north, the worst blizzard in Sierra Nevada history was forming over the mountains. She did not know that in 48 hours, 9 feet of snow would fall. She did not know that buildings would collapse, that a man would die walking 100 yards through the white, that everything built by human hands in the past 20 years would suffer damage while her tree stood unchanged. She knew only that she was sick and cold and alone, and that winter was not finished with her yet. On February 11th, 1890, the sky turned black at noon. Clara had spent the morning drifting in and out of fever sleep, too weak to do more than feed the stove when the cold woke her. The cough had settled deep in her chest, rattling with every breath. Her skin burned, her muscles ached. She had not eaten in 2 days. The effort of chewing seemed impossible. Through the gaps in her door, she watched the morning light fade. At first she thought clouds were rolling in from the west, normal storm clouds bringing normal snow, but these clouds were different. They moved too fast, churning and boiling across the sky like smoke from a fire. They swallowed the sun in minutes. By noon, the world outside her door had turned the color of iron. Then she heard the wind. It came up the canyon like a locomotive, a roar so deep she felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. The sequoia began to sway. Not the gentle movement she had felt during the November windstorm, but something deeper, something that made the walls groan and the floor tilt beneath her. Clara crawled to the woodpile and loaded the stove with everything she could reach. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the kindling twice. The fever made her clumsy, made her slow. By the time she had the fire built properly, the first snow was falling. Not falling, driving. The wind hurled the snow sideways, horizontal sheets of white that erased the world outside her door. Clara could not see the nearest tree. She could not see 5 feet beyond the opening of the hollow. She wedged the door shut and crawled back to her bed. The storm had arrived. Hour 1. The wind screamed. The sequoia swayed. Clara lay on her pine bough bed beneath every blanket she owned, shivering so hard her teeth rattled. The temperature inside the hollow was 44 degrees, cold but survivable. The stove was burning well, the fire crackling against the iron walls, heat radiating into the small space. But Clara could not stop shivering. The fever had stripped her ability to retain warmth. Her body was fighting 2 battles at once, the sickness inside and the cold outside, and losing both. She forced herself to drink, melted snow from the clay pot near the stove, lukewarm and tasteless. The water hit her stomach and stayed there, neither helping nor hurting. She needed food, but the thought of eating made her nauseous. Outside, the wind continued to scream. Hour 6. Evening, though Clara could not tell the difference. The world beyond her door was uniform gray. The light diffused through billions of falling snowflakes until day and night became meaningless. The temperature inside had dropped to 40 degrees. The fire had burned down to coals while she slept. Clara dragged herself from the bed, added 2 logs to the stove, blew on the coals until flames caught. The effort left her gasping, dark spots swimming at the edges of her vision. She collapsed back onto the bed and pulled the blankets over her head. The tree swayed. Somewhere in the forest, she heard a crack, sharp and explosive like a gunshot. Then a crash that shook the ground. A tree had fallen, not the sequoia. Something else. Something weaker. Clara pressed her hand over her ears and prayed. Hour 12. Midnight. She woke to cold. Real cold. The kind that cut through blankets and fever alike and demanded attention. The stove was nearly out, just a few red embers glowing in the darkness. Clara tried to sit up and couldn't. Her arms had no strength. Her legs would not respond. The fever had peaked, and her body was shutting down. She lay in the darkness and listened to the wind. It had not stopped. It had not even slowed. For 12 hours straight, the storm had raged, and it showed no sign of ending. How much snow had fallen? 3 feet? 4? The door had not rattled in hours. Snow must have piled against it, sealing the hollow from the outside world. She could not get out now, even if she wanted to. The temperature inside was 38 degrees, still above freezing. The bark was doing its work, slowing the loss of heat, buying her time. In a wooden cabin with thin walls and gaps between the boards, she would already be dead. The cold would have seeped through in the first hour, and her fever-weakened body would have surrendered. But the Sequoia was not a cabin. The Sequoia was 2 feet of bark and 1,000 years of evolution and a design perfected by fire. The tree had survived worse than this. It would survive this, too. Clara forced herself to move. She rolled off the bed and onto the floor. The impact jarred her, sent pain shooting through her aching muscles. She crawled toward the stove, one arm at a time, dragging her useless legs behind her. The woodpile was 6 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. She reached the wood. She grabbed a log. She fed it into the stove, missing the opening twice before finally getting it inside. Then another log, then kindling. Then she blew on the embers until her vision went white and her lungs burned and flames finally caught. The fire came back to life. Clara lay on the floor beside the stove, too weak to return to the bed, and felt the heat begin to spread. She was alive. The tree was standing, the fire was burning. The storm continued outside, but inside, Clara Briggs was still breathing. Hour 18, dawn of the second day, February 12th. The fever began to break. Clara woke drenched in sweat, her blanket soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then the walls of the hollow came into focus, the curved bark, the pale light filtering through the gaps in the door, and she remembered. The storm was still raging. She could hear the wind, could feel the Sequoia swaying, but something had changed. Her head was clearer. Her muscles responded when she tried to move them. The fire in her blood had cooled to something manageable. She sat up slowly, testing her strength. The temperature inside the hollow was 36 degrees, colder than before, colder than any night since she had moved into the tree. But the fever had masked how cold she truly was. Now, with her body no longer burning from within, she felt the chill properly. She crawled to the stove and built the fire higher. She melted snow and drank until her stomach ached. She ate a handful of dried acorns, chewing slowly, forcing herself to swallow. The storm showed no sign of stopping. How much wood had she burned? Clara looked at the pile near the stove. It was half gone, a quarter cord consumed in 18 hours. At this rate, she would run out in 3 days. But she was alive. That was what mattered. She was alive, and the tree was standing, and the bark was holding. She would worry about firewood later. Hour 24, noon of the second day. The snow had risen past the level of her door. Clara discovered this when she tried to open it, pushing against the planks and finding them immovable, wedged shut by the weight of snow piled against the outside. She pushed harder, putting her shoulder into it, but the door would not budge. She was buried. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Clara felt a strange calm. If she was buried, then the snow was insulating the hollow even further. The temperature inside had stabilized at 40 degrees despite the storm outside. The bark and the snow together formed a barrier that even the Alaska cyclone could not penetrate. She was trapped, yes, but she was also protected. She fed the fire and returned to bed and listened to the wind slowly begin to die. Hour 36, midnight of the second day. February 12th, turning into February 13th. The fever broke completely. Clara woke clear-headed for the first time in days. The sweat had dried. Her muscles no longer ached. The cough remained, but it was looser now, productive, bringing up the sickness instead of trapping it inside. She stood for the first time in 2 days. Her legs wobbled but held. She walked to the stove, added wood, then walked to the door and pushed. It moved. The snow on the other side had settled, compacted by its own weight. Clara pushed harder, and the door scraped open, revealing a wall of white. She could not see the sky. She could not see the clearing. She saw only snow, 10 feet of it, burying the world outside her hollow. But the wind had stopped. The silence was enormous. After 36 hours of screaming wind and driving snow, the sudden stillness felt like a physical weight pressing against her ears. Clara stood in the narrow gap between her door and the wall of snow and breathed air so cold it burned her lungs. She was alive. The tree was standing. The storm was ending. Hour 48, noon of the third day, February 13th. The sky cleared. Clara dug a tunnel through the snow and emerged into a transformed world. Where there had been a forest, there was now a field of white, punctuated by the tops of trees that had been buried to their crowns. The sequoia rose from the snow like a monument, its cinnamon bark dusted with ice crystals that sparkled in the sudden sunlight. She walked around the tree, inspecting it for damage. There was none. No cracks in the bark. No splits in the wood. No sign that the storm had affected it at all. The sequoia had swayed, had groaned, had bent, but it had not broken. Clara looked at the other trees in the clearing. A pine had fallen across her old woodpile site, its roots torn from the frozen earth. An oak had snapped 20 feet up, its crown buried somewhere in the drifts. Smaller trees lay everywhere, their trunks cracked and splintered by the weight of snow and the force of wind. But the sequoia stood, as it had stood for 1,000 years, as it would stand for 1,000 more. She returned to the hollow and counted her remaining firewood. 3/4 of a cord, enough for perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful. The worst of winter was behind her now. February storms were rarely followed by February storms, but March could still be cold, and April sometimes brought late snow. She would need more wood, soon. But first, she needed to rest. She needed to recover from the fever that had nearly killed her. She needed to eat and drink and rebuild her strength. The storm had tested her. The storm had nearly won. But Clara Briggs was still alive. She did not learn what had happened in Hammond until a week later. The snow was too deep to travel. For 7 days, Clara stayed near the sequoia, venturing out only to gather fallen branches from the surface of the drifts. The wood was wet. It would need to dry before it burned properly, but she stacked it near the tree and hoped for the best. On February 20th, a path had been trampled through the snow from Hammond. Clara followed it to the settlement and found a community in ruins. The general store roof had collapsed on the second night of the storm. Thomas Bridger, the owner, had been inside taking inventory when the weight of snow proved too much for the rafters. The structure had come down all at once, timbers and shingles and 10 feet of snow burying him where he stood. His neighbors had heard his cries. They had dug for 6 hours, working through the blizzard with shovels and bare hands, finally pulling him from the wreckage before dawn. His legs were crushed beneath a beam. The doctor, there was no real doctor, just a man who had served as a surgeon's assistant in the army, had done what he could. Thomas Bridger would lose both legs. He would never walk again. 3 other buildings had collapsed, 2 cabins and a storage shed. Their roofs buckled under snow loads they were never designed to bear. The church had survived, but its windows had blown in during the second night, and the pews were buried under drifts. The Lovelace family had lost a mule. The animal had sheltered in a lean-to on the edge of their property, a structure that offered no protection from the wind. They found it frozen solid the morning after the storm. But the worst news came from the Sequoia colony. Warren Hobbs was 72 years old. He had joined the colony 5 years earlier, a widower from San Francisco who believed in the cooperative dream and wanted to spend his remaining years among people who shared his ideals. He was not strong enough for road-building work, so he tended the colony's vegeting and kept the accounts. On the second day of the storm, during a brief lull in the wind, Hobbs had volunteered to check on a family in an outlying cabin. The Marshalls had a sick child, and the colony's doctor had medicine that might help. Hobbs had walked the route 100 times. It was less than a quarter-mile from the main settlement to the Marshall cabin. He never arrived. They found his body 3 days later when the snow had settled enough to search. He was 100 yards from safety, his tracks showing that he had become disoriented in the whiteout and walked in circles until exhaustion and cold overcame him. He had died facing the wrong direction, reaching for a cabin that was behind him instead of ahead. Martin Cawley told Clara the news when she reached Hammond. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. "We lost 2 buildings," he said. "Tents, mostly, but one of the permanent structures, too. The dining hall roof caved in. We were burning furniture by the end, trying to keep everyone warm." He looked at Clara, thin, pale, still coughing, but alive. "How did you survive?" Clara did not know how to answer. She had survived because the bark was 2 feet thick. She had survived because the tree had stood for 1,000 years and knew how to endure. She had survived because fire had hollowed the core and left behind walls that could hold warmth. "The tree," she said. "The tree kept me alive." Cawley stared at her for a long moment. Then he asked to see it. Silas Lovelace came 3 days later. He rode up the mountain on a horse too thin for the work, following the trail that others had trampled through the drifts. Clara was sitting outside the Sequoia when he arrived, mending a tear in her coat, enjoying the weak February sunshine. She had not expected him. She had not expected anyone from the settlement that had dismissed her, that had called her foolish, that had predicted her death. Lovelace dismounted and stood in the snow, staring at the tree. 10 feet of white surrounded the Sequoia. The bark rose from the drifts like a pillar, cinnamon-colored, scarred by ancient fire but unbroken by modern storm. Smoke trickled from the flue pipe Clara had cut. Light flickered through the gaps in the door. The tree stood exactly as it had stood for 1,000 years. "I heard you made it," Lovelace said at last. "I made it." "I heard the colony lost a man. I heard Bridger lost his legs. I heard half the buildings in Hammond are damaged or destroyed." "I heard that too." Lovelace walked closer to the tree. He touched the bark with his hand, feeling its texture, its thickness. He looked at the door, at the mud and pitch ceiling, at the flue pipe emerging from 18 inches of insulation. "I told you that tree would kill you," he said. "I said they'd find your bones in spring." Clara waited. Lovelace turned to face her. His expression was not humble. He was not a humble man, but it was something close, something that cost him to show. "I was wrong," he said. "I've been ranching these hills for 23 years, and I've never seen anything stand through a storm like that one. Roofs collapsed, walls fell, a man died walking 100 yards. But your tree didn't move." He looked at the Sequoia again, as if seeing it for the first time. "You figured out something I didn't know was possible." He left without another word. The next day, he returned with a quarter quart of firewood, 2 pounds of bacon, and a bag of flour. He did not call it charity. He called it payment for a lesson. Word spread quickly through the foothills. The Briggs girl had survived the worst storm in memory inside a hollow tree. Martin Cawley came first, bringing notebooks and measuring twine. He spent an hour inside the Sequoia, feeling the temperature difference between inside and outside, measuring the bark thickness, asking Clara to explain every detail of her construction. "The colony needs this," he said. "We need shelters that can't collapse. Warren Hobbs would be alive if he'd had somewhere safe to wait out the storm." Clara showed him the door construction, the stove placement, the floor insulation. She explained the logic that had guided her, the quilt analogy, the fire resistance reasoning, the observation that standing sequoias survived while everything else fell. Cawley took notes on everything. Within a week, 3 families from the colony had visited. They brought questions and measuring tools and the particular intensity of people who had lost something precious and were determined not to lose it again. How much wood did you burn? 1 cord during the 7-day crisis. What was the coldest temperature inside? 34 degrees, the night my fever broke. Did the tree sway? Yes, but it didn't fall. It's been standing for 1,000 years. It knows how to sway. By late February, the colonists had identified 3 fire-hollowed sequoias in the giant forest suitable for habitation. They began planning a storage cache in the largest one, a dead standing tree with an interior cavity 12 feet wide. Insurance against the next big storm, Colley said. We should have thought of this years ago. Clara did not ask for credit. She did not claim ownership of the idea. When the colonists thanked her, she shook her head. The tree did the work. I just moved in. Hale Tharp heard about Clara in early March. Tharp was 70 years old in 1890, a rancher who had spent his summers in a fallen sequoia log at Log Meadow since 1861. His cabin was famous among the settlers, a horizontal giant hollowed by fire, fitted with a door and window and chimney. John Muir had visited in 1875 and called it a noble den in a fallen sequoia. When Tharp heard about the girl who had survived the February storm inside a standing sequoia, he reportedly laughed. Someone finally figured out what the trees were for, he said. He sent Clara a gift through Martin Colley, a piece of advice and a jar of honey. The advice was simple. Standing trees don't last, fallen ones do. Move into a log before the snows come next year. The honey was from his own bees, sweet and golden and more valuable than money in the mountains. Clara kept the jar on a shelf inside the sequoia. She never opened it. It was proof that someone understood, someone who had lived in a hollow tree for 30 years, who knew what the bark could do, who had figured out the same thing she had figured out decades before. She was not crazy. She was not foolish. She was one of the people who had learned to read what the forest was telling them. The trees were shelters. They had always been shelters. You just had to be desperate enough to listen. Emmett Grady did not visit the sequoia after the storm. He did not congratulate Clara. He did not acknowledge her survival. He did not apologize for the threats he had made or the debts he had tried to collect. But the threats stopped. Clara heard from others that Grady had lost standing in the settlement. His mill camp had suffered badly in the storm. 2 bunkhouses collapsed, equipment buried, workers injured. He had been away when it happened, safe in a hotel in Visalia, and his men did not forget that their foreman had abandoned them to the storm while a 17-year-old girl survived alone in a tree. The talk of collecting her uncle's debt stopped. The menacing looks stopped. Grady passed Claire on the trail to Hammond once, in early April, and looked straight through her as if she did not exist. By summer, he had left Tulare County for a logging operation in Oregon. Clara never saw him again. She did not mourn his absence. She did not celebrate it either. He was simply gone, another piece of the winter that had tried to kill her and failed. In the years following the winter of 1890, at least 7 documented shelters were built inside fire-hollowed sequoias in Tulare County. The Sequoia colony established 3 before their dissolution in 1892, storage caches and emergency shelters scattered through the giant forest. Ranchers in the foothills created 2 more, positioned along mountain trails where storms could trap travelers without warning. 2 were built by individuals whose names were not recorded, people who heard about the Briggs girl and decided to try the same method for themselves. Clara shared her design with anyone who asked. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She walked visitors through the hollow and pointed out her mistakes, the door gaps that let in drafts, the imperfect chimney seal that smoked on windless days. She charged nothing. She filed no patents. She claimed no ownership of an idea that belonged to the forest. When George W. Stewart visited in April, the editor of the Visalia Delta, the man who would later architect the creation of Sequoia National Park, Clara gave him a tour but declined to be named in his article. "The tree did the work," she told him. "I just moved in." Stewart wrote about the Sequoia shelters anyway. He did not mention Clara by name, but he mentioned that they worked. That winter had proved them, that the trees had been standing for millennia and would stand for millennia more, and perhaps humans could learn something from that. Clara Briggs lived in her Sequoia through the spring of 1890. She watched the snow melt and the creeks rise and the wildflowers bloom across the meadows. She gathered firewood for the following winter, though she no longer feared the cold the way she once had. She had survived February. Nothing March or April could produce would be worse. In May, when the roads opened and the passes cleared, she walked to Visalia and found work as a cook at a boarding house. Her hands were calloused now, her face weathered, her body lean with muscle instead of soft with youth. The women who had crossed the street to avoid her now nodded in passing. The men who had looked at her with predatory eyes now looked at her with something closer to respect. She had survived a Sierra winter alone. Not many could say that. Not many would try. She married a carpenter named Samuel Whitmore in 1893. He was a quiet man who built houses in Three Rivers and did not ask too many questions about her past. They moved into a proper house with proper walls and a proper roof, and Clara learned to sleep without listening for the creak of wood in the wind. But she never forgot the tree. Neighbors said she visited it every spring, walking the 6 miles from Three Rivers to the clearing where the Sequoia still stood. She would sit outside the hollow for an hour, sometimes 2, looking at the bark, remembering the winter that had nearly killed her and the tree that had kept her alive. She stopped making the trip when her legs grew too weak for the climb. By then she was past 70, her hair white, her face lined with decades of sun and wind. The tree, she assumed, was still standing. The trees always stood. Clara Briggs Whitmore died in 1947 at age 75. She was buried in the Three Rivers Cemetery, 100 yards from the Sequoia River, 15 miles from the Sequoia that saved her life. On February 11, 1890, 9 feet of snow fell in 48 hours. The wind howled at 60 miles per hour. Buildings collapsed. A man died walking 100 yards through the white. The railroad was blocked for weeks. Cattle froze in their pastures. It was the worst storm in Sierra Nevada memory, the kind of storm that settlers would measure all future storms against. Silas Lovelace, who had ranched the Sequoia foothills for 23 years, had told Clara Briggs plainly, "A girl alone can't survive a foothill winter. You'll freeze inside that rotted-out tree, and when spring comes, they'll find your bones picked clean by bears." But when spring came, they found Clara Briggs alive. Thin, yes, weathered. Changed in ways that would never fully heal, but alive, sitting in weak February sunshine outside a hollow Sequoia that had stood for 1,000 years and would stand 1,000 more. She had $4, no family, and needed shelter she could not build. So she moved into a shelter the forest had already made. The tree is still standing. Anyone who visits the giant forest can find it, if they know where to look, a dead sequoia with a small door fitted into the bark, 2 feet thick, weathered but unbroken. The stove is gone, taken by time or by scavengers. The pine boughs have long since rotted away, but the hollow remains, the walls still curved and solid, still holding whatever warmth the sun provides. The bark that kept out fire could keep out cold. Clara Briggs proved it.